Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in today. We have a special guest we will be visiting with, and it should be a very interesting subject. Our guest is Rob Campia, and he is the Executive Director of the Marijuana Policy Project, which was started in 1995 by Rob. Rob, welcome to our program today.
Thanks for having me on.
This is something you've worked on for a long time. I've been aware of it, and I've been involved for a long time, probably from a different viewpoint, strictly from Washington, and dealing with it as an issue, in my congressional district, because there were times when it wasn't nearly as open to discussion as it is today, thanks to much of what you have done on this. But a lot of people are interested in marijuana legalization for different reasons, and I want to find out from you which one might be more important, or which one was the most politically beneficial, because a lot of people talk about the medicinal marijuana, and that's important. We talk about people wanting marijuana for recreational reasons. Some people want it legalized because they can collect more taxes. Some are interested in it strictly as a freedom issue, and some for a constitutional issue, believing the states have a right to nullify intrusive and abusive federal laws. Now, where do you come down on all this, and which one was the most helpful in achieving the success that you have achieved in the several states that we have now that have legalized marijuana?
So we all have our private reasons for why we support legalizing marijuana, but the three reasons that really resonate with the public, not only through polling and focus groups, but also in real life experience. The three reasons are, first, that marijuana is actually safer than alcohol, both to the individual user as well as to society. And so since as a society, we've already agreed that while alcohol is harmful to some extent, it's better to legalize it than to prohibit it. The same argument is also applicable to marijuana. So that's one. The second is easy to understand, which is that law enforcement should be spending their time on serious crimes rather than sniffing under people's doors for nonviolent marijuana crimes that are really consensual adult crimes, if you will. And then the third and last reason is that right now, the marijuana that's being sold across the U.S. and across the world is almost exclusively through the criminal market, making drug dealers and cartels wealthy. It's better to pull that into a legally regulated market and actually allow business people to hire legitimate employees and make a few dollars.
Tell me how much you were involved during your time you were in college. Was that when you started the policy project? And what the attitudes were like and how you were received, say, back in the 90s compared to what's happening today?
Oh, it's completely different today. It's so much better today. When I was in college at Penn State, I wasn't politically active. I was an occasional marijuana user, got arrested, put in jail for 3 months for growing my own marijuana in my apartment. And then when I got out of jail, I got politically active. And we had some early successes. I was elected student body president of the second largest student body in the country. We were able to reform the marijuana policies at the university level. But at the same time, people were very angry with what we were doing. I mean, there were some times where I was in bars at Penn State and people would dump beer on my head because they were so upset with what I was doing on the legalization issue. And now in Washington, D.C., when I go out to bars and talk to people, they're not dumping beer on my head. They're actually buying me beers.
There's a lot of people involved in this argument, pro-marijuana, and the people are against it. Sometimes the people against the marijuana, aren't necessarily, doing it on principle. What about the lobbying groups that wanted marijuana illegal because it was an intrusion on what they were selling or doing? For instance, the drug dealers didn't want it done, and you mentioned alcohol in your opening statement. I'm sure the alcoholic companies probably didn't want it legalized and don't want it illegalized. And what about the people who sell tranquilizers? Do you think did they ever line up and lobby for these laws that you know of?
Quite frankly, in my experience in Washington, D.C., which is 21 years, I have never seen alcohol lobbyists, pharmaceutical companies, or tobacco companies lobbying to keep marijuana illegal. I think partially some of those companies and institutions don't view marijuana as a serious threat either to their bottom line, or they don't view legalization as imminent. And so why would you want to lobby on something that's not actually a hot and pressing issue? So in terms of my experience, I'm not actually too concerned with those big institutions. The biggest opponent of legalization is law enforcement.
But then also those who come from a religious viewpoint, I'm sure whether they lobby or not, they put a lot of pressure. I knew that when we had some token votes in the Congress and we'd get a few, there was a lot more support than the votes were just for trying to loosen up the laws against marijuana. But they were always fearful of what the religious right would do. And I always felt pleased because I took a very strong position, and my district was considered part of the Bible Belt and very religious, and yet they did understand the argument. That's why I have been fairly optimistic about these changes. But you already said that there's a definite difference between when you were in college and the attitudes about marijuana and today. It's dramatically different. We have several states now that have changed their laws. Tell us what you see in the future. Do you expect something big to happen in Washington where they'll change the regulation? Or is it still going to be one state at a time and hoping that maybe the feds will just lay off and quit enforcing the law?
Well, we have seen a marked improvement in Congress in the last year. That amendment that you used to support when you were in Congress that would prohibit the DEA and the Justice Department from spending taxpayer money to interfere with state medical marijuana laws. As you know, that amendment, when you were in Congress, it failed every single time. And then this past May, it finally passed for the first time on the House floor, controlled by Republicans. So we actually have reason to be optimistic in Congress compared to where we were a few years ago. However, the strategy that we have nationally is to keep focusing on state changes. So we're going to have a big vote on legalization in Alaska and in Oregon this November 4th. I think maybe one out of the two will pass. It's kind of tough to tell at this point. And then we're going to have another wave of legalization victories in 2016 on the state level. And then that, I think, is finally going to prompt Congress to get more serious about this in 2017.
How do you handle the tax issue? Do you talk about it much, or do you use it as another reason to move in the direction away from all these laws? What actually is your position on that?
On the tax issue, our position is that we think that marijuana should be taxed similarly to alcohol. Of course, a pure libertarian would rather marijuana be treated like tomatoes with almost no regulation whatsoever and maybe no taxes. However, in real life, when you're talking about trying to bring marijuana into a market that looks similar to alcohol, where people 21 and older can use alcohol or marijuana at home or in a hotel room or what have you, then usually there's a tax attached to that. And so our position is excise tax that's reasonable, and then whatever the state sales tax is would also be attached to the sale of marijuana.
Of course, I abhor more taxes and would be opposed to wanting to tax anything like that. But the one pragmatic argument you could make is, well, yeah, there would be taxes on that and somebody's going to be paying it. But how many less taxes should we be paying if we don't have to pay the law enforcement people to enforce all these horrible laws? I imagine there would be a net benefit to that. But I don't want that to be an argument from my viewpoint that, oh, yeah, let's go ahead and tax it. Because, of course, my answer to all this need for taxation is to get rid of all the spending and that sort of thing. So I'll take that position. But anyway, it sounds to me like there's been a lot of progress. What immediately is the most important state that you're working on that you think you're going to come out with a victory?
With Alaska, the vote's on November 4th, and the initiative looks like the Colorado law that we passed in November of 2012, which means basically treating marijuana like alcohol for people 21 and older. The Alaska polling is hovering at around 50%, and I have to say I am nervous. I mean, it could go either way at this point. So we're just trying to run the best campaign that we can. And then also, if I could predict the future, I would say the first state that's going to legalize marijuana through the legislature rather than a vote of the people will be Rhode Island. And that, I think, will happen either in the spring of 2015 or the spring of 2016.
Now, as we close out here, I'd like you to mention how individuals can get to your webpage and get more information, and whether or not your webpage can dissect it out and find out what each state is doing. Let's say somebody's from a particular state and they don't have any idea what kind of progress is being made or the contacts. Could you tell us a little bit about that information that might be available to our listeners?
Absolutely. So our web address is www.mpp.org. So MPP stands for Marijuana Policy Project. And when you get to our website, there's a menu where you can just choose what state you're in, and then it provides an overview of what's happening with either ballot initiatives or with legislation in the state legislature. So it's actually pretty user-friendly.
Okay, we're going to have to go now, but I want to thank you, Rob, very much for being with us today, and keep us up to date on how these projects go.
Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for your work over these decades to help to try to end the drug war. I think you're going to see marijuana legal in our lifetimes.
And I want to just say a little message here to the listeners. I want to thank you, of course, for tuning in. And I consider this a very important project. And I mentioned a lot of different reasons why people are interested in this project. But mine is rather simplified. Of course, it's not to raise taxes or anything like that. Mine is a freedom issue. I believe that people should have the freedom to make their own choices. They should have the freedom to decide how much alcohol they should drink. Prohibition didn't work, and how to handle a dangerous problem. So drugs can be dangerous if they're overused, and total legalization is one argument libertarians can make. But to me, it's freedom of choice, and who's responsible for our safety. It's not the government. I do not like the idea of the nanny state. And the other reason why I like this issue is it emphasizes where these laws should originate. And you know, the bill that I am interested in there would defer to the states, and the federal government couldn't override the states that legalize the use of marijuana. So I see this as a positive in the step of nullification, where states should and must reclaim the right to nullify bad federal laws. And a lot of that is going on. So right now, we're in the middle of that, and that's why I'm anxious to see this continued, because I believe this is once again an effort to reduce the size and scope and the nonsense of our federal government in returning the responsibility to our states and to us as individuals. Thank you very much for being with us today, and come back soon.